In 1942, Britain faced the very real prospect of losing the Second World War. Everywhere, British forces were in retreat. Nowhere was the situation worse than in North Africa. Forget what you've been told about Stalingrad being the turning point of the war. The turning point was here, in these desert sands. The men who fought here were the British and Commonwealth troops of the 8th Army, and the men who ultimately guided them to victory were soldiers from Ulster. I've always been fascinated by this story, by the battles that were fought here, and by the generals, the Ulster generals, who fought them. Occasionally they were allies, often they were bitter enemies, but they were all Ulstermen.
I'm Tim Collins, and I'm a soldier from Ulster too, and I want to know more about the Ulstermen who won the Second World War.
The desert is the purest theatre of war. For a soldier, there is no environment like this. It's flat, it's vast, the sun burns your eyes and melts the horizon. It's like a furnace during the day, and it's like a freezer at night. Soldiers of the British Army have been fighting in the desert for generations. A couple of years ago, I was one of them, fighting against Saddam Hussein's forces in Iraq.
Tough though the Iraq War was, it pales in comparison to what happened here over 60 years ago in the North African desert. In this parched and dry landscape, Britain and her allies stared into an abyss. If the Desert War was lost, then the Second World War was unwinnable. This was Britain's front line.
By the early summer of 1941, British forces in North Africa were under attack. With the United States not yet in the war, British soldiers were fighting alongside soldiers from South Africa, Australia, India, and New Zealand. The German forces, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, were pushing towards Egypt. In their way stood the port city of Tobruk.
Tobruk was vital for three reasons. First of all, it was a seaport into which supplies could be landed, men, ammunition, and above all fuel that would feed the offensive in the coming year. Secondly, it represented Britain's defiance. It was the mighty fortress that would not fall. It was Churchill's line in the sand to Hitler. And thirdly, and most importantly, it was the first step to Egypt. And this is why the Desert War was being fought, because what lay beyond Egypt was crucial to victory in the war.
400 miles east of Egypt is Iraq and Iran, and underneath Iraq and Iran is oil. And then, as now, no modern mechanized army can fight without oil. Rommel knew that if he could conquer Egypt, he'd be able to claim the oil fields of the Gulf for himself. The British war effort would be crippled, and the Axis powers would be able to feed their war machine indefinitely. The stakes in the desert could not be higher. Britain's commander-in-chief in the Middle East was General Sir Archibald Wavell. But in June 1941, frustrated by the turn of events, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had decided to remove him from command.
It was only after the disasters had occurred in the desert that I realized how overloaded and undersustained Wavell's organization was. Wavell tried his best, but the handling machine at his disposal was too weak to enable him to cope with the vast mass of business which 4 or 5 simultaneous campaigns forced upon him.
Churchill needed someone who could handle this huge and vital command. His choice as new Commander-in-Chief Middle East was Claude John Auchinleck. He arrived in Cairo via India, Norway, and Enniskillen.
Claude Auchinleck was Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, based here in Fermanagh. The regiment was formed here in 1689, and indeed Claude Auchinleck soldiered here in 1912. Enniskillen is a frontier town, and frontier was very much Claude Auchinleck's experience, from Fermanagh to Simla in India to the Western Desert.
Claude Auchinleck's early life in Fermanagh had been tough. His father had died when he was just 8 years old, leaving the family impoverished. But the army offered Auchinleck a way out of poverty and out of Fermanagh. In 1904, he joined the British Indian Army, an organisation quite separate from the army at home.
Auchinleck was a very decisive man, very strong personality. His disadvantage was that he was a soldier from the Indian Army, the British officer's Indian Army, and therefore he didn't really know as much about the home-based British Army as a British general would have done.
He's a very experienced officer. He was known as a man of unshakable character, but he doesn't really know the officers and men of the British Army particularly well, because most of his service has actually been out in the Middle East and India.
The outsider from Fermanagh now found himself at the centre of the most critical theatre of the war. Facing Auchinleck in the desert was General Erwin Rommel. Rommel himself was a brilliant, instinctive soldier. He understood the possibilities that the desert offered a general who had the armour to back up his quick thinking.
If you made a mistake facing Rommel, he would always punish that mistake severely. He was a true opportunist on the battlefield. He always seized opportunities wherever he saw them.
Rommel was a gambler, an audacious strategist. He placed great faith in the value of speed, mobility and surprise. These tactics and this army were ideally suited to this theatre.
But Rommel wasn't the only adversary Auchinleck had to worry about. Dealing with Winston Churchill took up almost as much of his time as Rommel did, and the Prime Minister was just as demanding.
The main thing about Winston Churchill as a war leader is his enormous drive and energy. He's not really interested when generals come to him and explain all their difficulties.
When he got involved in operations, in theatre operations, frankly his judgment was not good. He was very impulsive.
The man at Churchill's side was General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, from Tobruk in County Fermanagh, the land of dreary spars, according to Churchill. No British soldier of the 20th century faced a task as difficult as that taken on by Alan Brooke. Every day for 4 years, he had the job of keeping Churchill's wilder impulses under control, while simultaneously devising a strategy for winning the war. "I know those Brookes," Churchill had said when Brooke was appointed. "Stiff-necked Ulstermen, and there's no one worse to deal with than that." But Brooke and Churchill, one impetuous and romantic, the other pessimistic and professional, formed a creative partnership that was to see Britain through to the end of the war. Churchill could see long lists of equipment heading out to the desert and wondered why on earth Auchinleck didn't order an immediate attack.
But the Auk knew that whilst he had equipment and men, he wasn't ready to attack. The men needed time to acclimatise, and above all, time to train. Auchinleck was correct in taking this firm approach with the Prime Minister, but in doing so, he was to sow the seeds of a bitter conflict that would last the rest of his desert command and come close to destroying his career.
Auchinleck chose Dublin-born General Alan Cunningham as commander of his desert forces, the newly christened 8th Army. As soon as the 8th Army was adequately trained and supplied, Auchinleck and Cunningham would launch their first offensive against Rommel, codenamed Operation Crusader.
As a young officer, I read this book, On War, by Karl von Clausewitz. Although it was written 135 years before the Second World War, it might well have been written with Rommel, Cunningham and Auchinleck in mind. In the book he says, a conquering army is like the light of a lamp. As the oil that feeds it sinks and draws away from the focus, the light diminishes until it goes out altogether. What von Clausewitz is essentially saying is the more successful an army, the further it gets away from its main base, and therefore its lines of communication and its lines of supply extend, then overextend, and then snap. In other words, the more successful an army, the more vulnerable it becomes to counterattack. Here in this vast, flat, inhospitable terrain, von Clausewitz's theory becomes reality. And any general who's ever fought in the desert knows you're not just fighting your enemy, you're fighting the very desert itself.
Cunningham's plan was simple. He wanted to engage Rommel in a decisive tank battle at Gazala, a small crossroads in the desert. After this had been won, British forces would sweep up the remains of Rommel's forces and relieve Tobruk.
Cunningham's plan for Operation Crusader follows in a pattern of the Desert War of trying to surprise your opponent, seize the initiative, and then outflank or encircle your opponent so that he has to then fight at a disadvantage.
In the desert, a sandstorm lashed the 8th Army as it prepared for battle. In London, Churchill, who had his offensive at last, was exultant.
For the first time, British and Empire troops will meet the Germans with an ample supply of equipment in modern weapons of all kinds. The battle itself will affect the whole course of the war. Now is the time to strike the hardest blow yet struck for final victory, home, and freedom. The Desert Army may add a page to history which will rank with Blenheim and Waterloo. The eyes of all nations are upon you. All our hearts are with you. May God uphold the right.
On the morning of the 18th of November 1941, the 8th Army rolled out towards Gazala. Operation Crusader had begun. In total, Allied forces amounted to 600 tanks and 100,000 men. They were steeled for an immense, decisive battle. But as so often happens in war, things didn't go exactly to plan. Instead of finding Rommel's divisions, they found nothing.
The problem is that the place where Cunningham selects the decisive battle will be fought is, a mark on the map. There's nothing decisive about the place, Gazala. It's not actually far enough in to the Axis rear to force a reaction and force them to fight. So the 8th Army then has to sit down and think, well, what do we do now? Cunningham begins to try measures which will force a reaction from the Axis. The problem is that he sends rather than keeping his army together, he begins to send his armoured brigades off in different directions, which dissipates their energy and strength.
This was a catastrophic strategy because now the 8th Army was thinly spread across a wide expanse of desert. And on the 22nd of November, Rommel, sensing that his opponent was weak and confused, decided that he would oblige Cunningham and fight.
Cunningham didn't know what Rommel was doing. He was blind. In the desert theatre, a commander needs to be able to go over a plan like lightning and make a decision. At that time, British commanders weren't trained to do this. Rommel did it instinctively, and that's what set him apart from every other commander in North Africa.
Rommel has to improvise a reaction to the British moves, which he doesn't fully understand. But of course, it's that kind of chaotic and confusing fight that Rommel excels in, because he can scent an opportunity on the battlefield and then take advantage of it.
Cunningham, on the other hand, is confused by the chaos. As he watched Rommel's attack, he decides that the Germans are in fact retreating. In Cairo, the British triumphantly announced that Rommel was defeated.
What actually happened here was completely different from what the British were telling the world, and from what Cunningham and Auchinleck themselves thought had happened.
Two panzer divisions had attacked the 7th Armoured Division and virtually annihilated it.
And now, with Rommel in personal charge, the Germans had surrounded the remnants of the British 7th Armoured Brigade here at Sidi Rezegh Aerodrome, and they were intent on finishing the job. Auchinleck now faced a difficult choice. Cunningham's plan clearly had not worked. British losses were mounting, and Rommel was in the ascendancy. The dilemma that faced the Commander-in-Chief was whether to plough on with Operation Crusader or to admit defeat and call the assault off.
On the 23rd of November, Claude Auchinleck visited the beleaguered commander of the 8th Army.
Cunningham was obviously worried by the collapse and disintegration of his armoured formations. He had every reason to be, so should I have been in his place. He did not strike me as emotionally disturbed, but obviously under great strain, again very naturally, as the battle had not gone according to plan and the change in it had been kaleidoscopic. He said that if we went on as we had been, we might be left without tanks, while the Germans might still have some, in which case Egypt would be in danger.
Cunningham was saying we really must retreat. Auchinleck said, no, I am sure that the enemy is in as bad a state as we are. The offensive will go on. And it's then that Claude Auchinleck, as Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, I think showed his mettle.
One of the most important attributes for any commander in battle is perception, the unique ability to cut through the fog of war and to work out what the situation is with your troops on the ground and with the enemy. That evening, Alan Cunningham wasn't able to do this, but Auchinleck was.
I thought Rommel was probably in as bad a shape as we were, and I ordered the offensive to continue. I certainly gambled. In fact, by going on, we might have lost all.
Auchinleck's decision was a gamble worthy of Rommel himself, and it was the right decision. It was a decision based on a unique feel for this theatre of war and for his enemy and their strengths and tactics.
He gives an example of a great commander's intuition, because there were these reports coming in that the 8th Army was down to about 20, 30 runners in the way of tanks, and it was his instinct, his professional instinct, that in fact the Germans were in as a bad case as we were.
Auchinleck was right, but Rommel had sensed panic at the top of the 8th Army. He decided to call Cunningham's bluff and charge directly at his headquarters.
Cunningham sees this move and thinks all is lost, that he's going to have to order a retreat. And it's Auchinleck who steps in and sees this. He realizes that this is actually a desperate last throw by his opposite number, by Rommel. So in that way, it's Auchinleck who finally perceives the Battle of Crusader, the battles of Operation Crusader, in the most clear light, and it's his determination to keep on, even when everything seems lost, that finally wins the day.
As Rommel's tanks slowed to a stop, Auchinleck decided that Cunningham was no match for his German adversary. With the battle still unresolved, he decided to fire the commander of the 8th Army. Cunningham had fought for only 8 days. It's a big decision to remove the commander at the height of a battle. It can cause dislocation in strategy. It can have a bad effect on morale. Troops look up to their commander, and they want to know that those giving the orders know what they're doing.
One of the most important things for any military commander is being able to stand the test of strain during any battle, particularly when things are going wrong, when things become difficult. And Cunningham had clearly broken under that pressure.
Here you were, in fact, actually relieving the man you had chosen only a month or so before to command this great offensive, and so this was it was a difficult decision. But Auchinleck had absolutely no doubt at all that it really had to be done, because here was a man who had really lost his nerve.
Auchinleck chose as Cunningham's replacement a young, relatively inexperienced Scottish soldier, Major General Neil Richie.
Auchinleck chose Richie because he thought it would do a sound job in continuing the battle. It was a solid, reliable sort of bloke.
Richie arrived at a time of immense confusion in the field. With Auchinleck now personally directing operations, the 8th Army gradually recovered its poise and took the fight to Rommel. Realising his bluff hadn't worked and desperately low on fuel, Rommel decided that discretion was the better part of valour and retreated. The 8th Army had won its first victory.
Auchinleck had shown that Rommel wasn't invincible. The courage and tenacity of British and Commonwealth troops was immense and gained great admiration, including from the Germans themselves. Mistakes had been made, but Auchinleck had shown real courage and vision in his handling of the battle against Rommel. He had been right to wait until his troops were trained and ready. And he'd been right to remain cool-headed when Rommel had counterattacked. And he was right in his judgment of when the Germans were in a difficult position and recognised Rommel's bluff and didn't rise to it. Auchinleck had become the first British general to defeat a German general in the Second World War.
As 1942 dawned, Auchinleck decided to launch a quick offensive against Rommel in order to capitalise on the success of Crusader. But events elsewhere conspired against him. At the start of December 1941, Britain declared war on Japan, and Churchill ordered large numbers of aircraft and men to detach from the 8th Army and head to the Far East.
It was about this time that Auchinleck took a decision that was to have a profound effect on his career and the conduct of the Desert War. Neil Richie's appointment had been a temporary one, a stand-in to ensure Operation Crusader went well. But now Auchinleck made that appointment permanent. On the 21st of January, Rommel made his move. He pushed 150 tanks down this road, the Via Balbia, towards the waiting British troops of the 1st Armoured Brigade. British defences were in total disarray. and fell back in front of Rommel's tanks. Rommel kept pushing his tanks on, even when they were running out of fuel. But such was the confusion in British lines, they kept retreating.
This was Richie's first real test in battle 1-to-1 against Rommel, without Auchinleck by his side. From the start, it was a mismatch. Rommel was a master of fast, agile warfare. Time and again, Richie failed to read his intentions. As his panzers approached the small town of Mekili, he feigned an attack. Panicking, Richie moved his armour to defend it. But Rommel's real intention was Benghazi in the north, and with it, thousands of tons of supplies that the British had painstakingly assembled. Benghazi fell so quickly that Rommel was in the town centre before the German High Command had even given him the permission to advance. Richie's first engagement with Rommel had proved to be a disaster. 8th Army had lost thousands of tons of equipment and supplies and been completely outwitted by the Germans.
Well, the point about Richie was that he was a very conventional soldier, not very imaginative, not very fast-thinking. And so when faced with somebody like Rommel, who attacked when he ought not to have attacked, to be ready to attack, and who moved very fast and exploited initial errors of dispositions on the part of the British, Richie really didn't know how to handle that.
Richie's performance had put doubt in Auchinleck's mind about his suitability as a commander. He dispatched a trusted aide to see Richie in order to get a better feel for what was going on. The man he sent was a fellow Ulsterman, one of the most brilliant and controversial soldiers of his generation.
Eric Dorman-Smith was a very intense man, filled with what might be termed zeal, or military zeal. And he, in some senses, worshipped at the temple of efficiency and wanted the British Army to be the best that it could be.
He was a very unorthodox and a very brilliant soldier. He was considered to be a really bright, thinking military brain.
I think he was a very keen soldier. He was determined to get things right. He was interested in his subject, which I think was something which many folk in those days were not. But he was also a very original thinker.
Eric Dorman-Smith, known as Chink to his friends, was born into a Catholic family in County Cavan in 1895. Urbane and ferociously bright, he counted Ernest Hemingway amongst his friends. But his enemies stretched from Cavan to Carrow and back again.
He had no compunction about embarrassing people and actually criticising them for stupidity or inefficiency. It made him a very awkward person to deal with.
He didn't butter people up. He didn't make political friendships. He never minded really who he hurt.
From an Englishman's point of view, he really was every bit of an Irishman who loved to fight and a verbal fight, an intellectual fight. And so there were all the plodders that he met along the way up in the army, right the way through, resented him.
Dorman-Smith had been horrified at the way Richie was commanding the 8th Army. When he reported back to Auchinleck, he didn't mince his words.
I am more than ever convinced that there must be radical and sweeping changes. I do see now why many things have gone wrong, and I have my ideas how they can be put right.
Chink came back and recommended that Richie should be replaced. He quipped, the 8th Army is more like a club than a disciplined entity.
I think Father's view of Richie was that he was too slow, too hidebound. If I can paraphrase A.A. Milne, I think he considered him a bear of very little brain indeed.
And there was regret there as well. Because Chink was kind, and he was compassionate to people. It was only at the instance that they had men's lives in their hands that he judged them.
Despite his own doubts, Auchinleck declined to take Dorman-Smith's advice. Richie would stay in command, for now.
It was in this empty wasteland that Richie set about reorganising his shaken army. But he fundamentally misunderstood what desert warfare is all about. It's a vast, empty place, ideal for an army that can act swiftly and decisively and change its plans quickly if necessary. It's much less than ideal for an army that's slow, that's rigid, and that's overcautious.
The 8th Army lined up outside the small Libyan town of Gazala in what were known as boxes, fixed groupings of infantry and supporting arms. The idea was to create a strong line of defence.
The problem, of course, is, again, all one of mobility, in that if you're fixed to a particular point in the desert, then yes, your position may be very formidable, it may be very difficult to attack, but more mobile troops can simply drive round behind the position and cut you off from any form of support. So eventually, that infantry box, if it's besieged, if it's surrounded, it will have run out of ammunition, it'll have run out of water, and there's really nothing that it can do apart from surrender.
From London, Churchill was urging Auchinleck to strike back against Rommel. Auchinleck refused, arguing that the 8th Army needed more equipment and more time to train. But time was something that the 8th Army had run out of. On the 26th of May 1942, Rommel attacked. Once again, the British had been caught completely by surprise. Unprepared and flat-footed, the 8th Army was no match for Rommel's panzers. After defeating British forces at Bir Hakeim, Rommel turned north, towards Tobruk. But Rommel didn't have it all his own way. The road to Tobruk was blocked by 4 British divisions.
And now Rommel had another problem. His plan had been bold enough to catch the British Army unawares, but also left him vulnerable and deep behind the 8th Army's lines. His supply lines were stretched, and he was running out of petrol.
The Germans were a long way from their petrol supplies. They were right up behind the British positions, and a really prompt, concentrated counterattack might have done them a vast deal of damage.
The reason the 8th Army didn't strike was that its high command was at least 24 hours behind events. The fog of war, in this case you could say the dust and sand of war, had obscured Richie's view of what was happening on the battlefield. The contrast with Rommel couldn't be more acute. This was a general who led from the front, literally. He could grasp what was happening on the ground, and he could act on it quickly.
On the 30th of May, Rommel led a supply train through the British lines and personally oversaw the resupply of his forces. This dangerous, audacious move is the kind of leadership that wins battles for generals. With Richie stranded 40 miles from the battle, Rommel had rescued a dangerous situation and was now ready to fight on. Eric Dorman-Smith was furious at what he saw as Richie's inadequacy.
For 2 weeks now, victory has been within our grasp, yet we haven't achieved it. The fault lies in ourselves. Auchinleck may have to pay a high price for his loyalty to a man who, behind an imposing facade, is a very ordinary occupational soldier.
With his tanks full of petrol again, Rommel made good his escape from under Richie's nose. Richie had passed up the chance to strike a fatal blow to his enemy and now compounded his mistake by convincing himself that he had Rommel on the run. But Rommel had no intention of running away from Richie.
In war, you have to be bold and you have to be alert. Rommel was a courageous and calculating risk-taker. His moves were unpredictable and skillfully executed. Richie, by contrast, was plotting and predictable, and Rommel knew exactly what Richie was likely to do.
On the 5th of June, the 8th Army charged at Rommel with the intention of finishing off what they believed to be a weakened enemy. It was a desperate mistake. Pounded by Rommel's anti-tank guns and harried by panzers, the British were routed. The defeat left the way clear for Rommel to advance on Tobruk.
All eyes now shifted to here, Tobruk. In 1942, it was a ruined, battle-scarred port. Its defences were weak and incapable of resisting any concerted German attack. And yet it remained strategically and psychologically important. It was the last town of any significance before the Egyptian frontier. And more importantly, it was heaving with British armaments and supplies.
On the 14th of June, with the 8th Army in disarray, Winston Churchill sent a telegram to Auchinleck.
Presume there is no question of giving up Tobruk. As long as Tobruk is held, no serious enemy advance into Egypt is possible.
This wasn't what Auchinleck wanted to hear. He feared that Tobruk was now too weak to withstand Rommel, and that any battle here would result in an inevitable and catastrophic defeat. But Auchinleck had no choice but to obey Churchill's order to stand and fight.
General Richie is putting into Tobruk what he considers an adequate force to hold it, even should it be temporarily isolated by the enemy. Basis of immediate future action by 8th Army is to use all available mobile forces to prevent enemy establishing itself east of Tobruk.
On the 18th of June, Richie met with Dorman-Smith and Auchinleck to discuss a way out of the crisis. Despite the desperate situation, Richie seemed calm and collected.
There was a general optimism and belief that Rommel would take his time over Tobruk, and that we had leisure to rearm and regroup. Auchinleck was disturbed by this atmosphere. He thought it was not yet the moment to relax.
Auchinleck was right to be worried. Rommel had no intention of slowing down now. As Richie was meeting with Auchinleck and Dorman-Smith, Rommel's forces closed the noose around Tobruk. 2 days later, they went in for the kill. As Stukas roared out of the skies and as German artillery pounded the tattered defences, the South African troops inside Tobruk desperately tried to hold off Rommel's advance. The rest of the 8th Army was already retreating across the border to Egypt. Inside the city, troops set fire to the vast petrol dumps and blew up new material to prevent them falling into German hands. On the 20th of June, Tobruk fell. 33,000 troops were captured. 2 days later, Hitler promoted Rommel to Field Marshal. Churchill was meeting US President Franklin Roosevelt when news of the fall of Tobruk reached him.
This is one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. Not only were its military effects grievous, but it had affected the reputation of the British armies. I did not attempt to hide from the President the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing. Disgrace is another.
As Claude Auchinleck flew to Richie's headquarters, his offer of resignation was already on the Prime Minister's desk.
Dear Prime Minister, the unfavourable course of the recent battle, culminating in the disastrous fall of Tobruk, impels me to ask you seriously to consider the advisability of retaining me in my command. Personally, I feel fit to carry on and reasonably confident of being able to turn the tables on the enemy in time. All the same, there is no doubt that in a situation like the present, fresh blood and new ideas at the top may make all the difference between success and stalemate.
The Prime Minister refused to accept it, quite rightly, because this was in the middle of a really fluid situation, and so he left Auchinleck in command. But I think one could say that with the fall of Tobruk really demolished Churchill's real respect and confidence in Auchinleck, even though he left him in command for the time being.
The fall of Tobruk really brings into question whether Britain will be a suitable and reliable ally for the United States as the United States begins to generate and put forth its power into the war. So Tobruk, this symbol, has a huge amount of political capital surrounding with it, and its loss then really is a stunning blow for the British.
Ultimately, someone had to pay for the calamity. Once more, Auchinleck faced the grim task of removing his choice of commander in the field. Neil Richie had lasted longer than Alan Cunningham, but the removal of his second commander in 8 months prompted many in Britain to question Auchinleck's ability to pick subordinates.
Auchinleck now took personal charge of the 8th Army. In reality, there wasn't much to take charge of. He immediately ordered there should be no more fight-to-the-death battles like the one that proved so calamitous at Tobruk. It's no exaggeration to say if the 8th Army was defeated, the Second World War was lost.
If that army was totally, finally destroyed, the way would then be open for Rommel to march to Cairo and Alexandria, and we would lose the whole of the Middle East. We would the Russian front would be partly undermined. It would be a theatre-scale catastrophe, not merely the defeat of one army.
Clausewitz wrote that the centre of gravity was the hub of all activity on which everything else depended. Auchinleck believed that everything, Cairo, Alexandria, the Mediterranean, Iraq, Iran, their oil, the very war itself, depended on the 8th Army's ability to continue to exist. This meant that they had to preserve themselves as a fighting force, and this was no time for futile heroic gestures.
This meant retreat east towards Cairo. Auchinleck knew he couldn't defeat Rommel in the open desert. He would pull his troops back to a better position nearer the city. In the Egyptian capital, British diplomats burned papers in anticipation of imminent defeat. In Alexandria, the Royal Navy weighed anchor and sailed out to safety. Cairo's residents prepared to welcome their German and Italian liberators.
The Eighth Army's now in full retreat, and in the chaos, hundreds of tons of stores are either lost or surrendered to Rommel. But von Clausewitz once again intervenes, because Rommel's advancing so fast his air force can't keep up, and so the Eighth Army isn't attacked from the air as it retreats. Yet Rommel reaches out to grab them, but he's slowing, and his supply lines are tightening, and the British remain agonizingly just out of touch. On the 30th of June, Claude Auchinleck stood here on the Daba Road and watched the shattered remnants of his army stream past towards the Nile Delta. Tanks and trucks, soldiers and all the clutter of a retreating army moved slowly past towards a dusty railway halt at Alamein, 20 miles in that direction. It was a heart-rending sight for any commander, but strangely, Auchinleck was optimistic. He wanted to fight at Alamein. He'd beaten Rommel before, and he reckoned he could do it again.
Auchinleck and Dorman-Smith had analysed the collapse of the defence of Egypt. At the moment of greatest crisis, the two Ulster soldiers had sketched out a way to fight back, and El Alamein would be the place where they would make their stand. Dorman-Smith wrote to his wife,
Worse situations have been retrieved by bold and courageous action. We'll see what can be done, but it won't be very orthodox. You think I'm an incurable optimist. I do look on the bright side. One must. But I try to look at things objectively, as a military scientist.
Auchinleck's orders to his men were belligerent.
The enemy is stretching to his limit and thinks we are a broken army. He hopes to take Egypt by bluff. Show him where he gets off.
Auchinleck knew he couldn't afford to lose another battle. He realised the future of the entire war depended on what happened in this desert, indeed what happened at this dusty little rail halt. And on that score, he was entirely correct. However, it would be another Irishman, another Ulsterman, whose name would forever be linked with El Alamein.